This is not a story of grand passions that burn like a wildfire, but of a quiet, steady flame tended in the hearth of a lonely home. It is a story for those who understand that true safety is not a locked door, but the gentle weight of a trusted hand, and that the most profound love grows in the silent spaces, nurtured by careful questions and whispered consent, until it is strong enough to call a place and a person home. Elias Thorne measured his life in the steady, rhythmic clang of his hammer against hot iron. His forge was a place of purpose, the smithy a kingdom of predictable heat and solid form. But when he latched the heavy door at the end of the day and walked the short path to his cabin, the world grew quiet, too quiet. Inside, order reigned. The floors were swept, the dishes clean. A single plate was set on the table, and beside it, a smaller one for his daughter. Lily was his heart, a silent 7-year-old shadow who moved through their shared space with a grief too heavy for her small shoulders. She had not spoken a word since her mother's passing 2 years prior, and her silence was a constant, aching counterpoint to the noise of the forge. He would find her sitting by the window, her gaze fixed on the distant hills, her rag doll held tight in her arms. He made her toys, a finely wrought iron horse, a tiny spinning top, and she would accept them with a solemn nod, but the joy he longed to see in her eyes never kindled. His love for her was a vast, helpless thing. He could build a house, shoe a horse, mend any broken thing made of wood or metal, but he could not mend his daughter's silence. He could not fix the loneliness that had settled into the very bones of their home. Every evening he would light a single lamp, the circle of its glow pushing back the shadows, but never quite filling the emptiness. He made a bed for one, his own, and tucked his daughter into hers, the brush of his large, calloused hand against her forehead, the only language he had to tell her she was loved. The hush of the house was a living thing, a testament to all that was missing. It was in that profound quiet, after Lily had fallen into a troubled sleep, that he would sit and feel the full weight of his own solitude, a need so deep and so long ignored that he no longer had a name for it. It was simply the air he breathed, the silence he lived in, until a hesitant knock on his door threatened to change everything. The woman standing on his porch looked like a bird caught in a storm, poised for flight yet too weary to move. Her dress was plain, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held a fierce, guarded intelligence. She clutched a worn satchel to her chest, like a shield, and held out a creased year-old newspaper advertisement. "I've come about the position," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the exhaustion visible in her posture. "For a governess." Elias had forgotten he'd even placed the ad, a desperate act in the early days of his grief, hoping another woman's presence might coax Lily from her shell. No one had ever answered. "The position is old," he said, his own voice rusty from a day of silence. "I'm a hard worker," she said quickly, a flicker of desperation in her eyes before she masked it. "I can cook clean. I am good with letters. I require only a room and board, nothing more." He saw the truth then. This wasn't about a governess position. This was a woman seeking refuge, a place to disappear. His own moral code, forged as true as the iron he worked, was simple. You did not turn away someone in need. But his life was a fragile balance of routine and quiet sorrow, and the thought of introducing a stranger into it, into Lily's silent world, was daunting. As if summoned by the thought, Lily appeared in the doorway behind him, a small, curious wraith. She peeked around his legs, her wide, solemn eyes fixing on the newcomer. The woman's gaze dropped to the child, and something in her guarded expression softened, a flicker of profound empathy. She did not offer a bright, false smile or cooing words. She simply looked at Lily, a quiet acknowledgment passing between them, one weary soul to another. Elias felt the subtle shift in the air. He looked from the woman's tired but determined face to his daughter's rare, focused interest. He was a man drowning in silence, and this woman was offering a hand. He didn't know if it would save him or pull him under, but he knew he had to take it. "The cabin is small," he said, the words a reluctant acceptance. "There is a room in the back. It was my wife's sewing room." He stepped back, holding the door open. "My name is Elias Thorne. This is my daughter, Lily." The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, then seemed to make a decision. "I am Clara," she said, omitting a surname as if to shed her past at the threshold. She stepped inside, and the lonely, silent air of the cabin was instantly changed. She brought with her the scent of dust and rain, and a deep, resonant quiet that, for the first time, did not feel like emptiness. Lily, who shied away from everyone, took a single deliberate step closer to Clara, her eyes still locked on the stranger's face. It was the most decisive movement Elias had seen her make in a year. Clara learned the landscape of the Thorne homestead like a cautious cartographer mapping new territory. She moved through the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, her purpose to be useful but invisible. She cleaned with a fierce, focused energy, scrubbing away not just the dust, but the lingering pall of settled grief. She organized the pantry, patched the worn linens, and cooked simple, nourishing meals that appeared on the table without fuss or fanfare. She spoke only when necessary, her words spare and practical. Yet Elias found himself acutely aware of her presence. He noticed the way she arranged wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, a splash of color in a world of brown and gray. He noticed the gentle, almost silent hum that sometimes escaped her lips when she was kneading bread, a sound of life in the quiet house. Her primary focus, however, was Lily. She never pushed the child, never demanded a response. Instead, she created invitations. She would sit at the kitchen table, sketching charcoal birds on scraps of paper, leaving a second piece of charcoal and paper on the other side. For days, Lily only watched from a distance. Then one afternoon, Clara looked up from her drawing to see Lily sitting opposite her, the small piece of charcoal clutched in her tiny hand, tentatively making her own marks. A trust was being built, stitch by quiet stitch, in a language that required no words. Clara began leaving Lily's portion of tea on the warmer side of the hearth. When mending the child's dress, she asked the silent girl's permission before taking the garment. Small acts of respect, of acknowledging the child's agency, that did not go unnoticed by her father. Elias would watch from the doorway of his forge, seeing Clara and Lily in the yard, not speaking, but existing together. Clara would read aloud from a book of poems, her voice a soft, melodic murmur, never asking if Lily was listening, simply trusting that the words were a comfort. The rigid, lonely guardedness in his own chest began to ache with a feeling he recognized as longing. One evening, Elias came in from the forge, his hands stained with soot. As he went to the wash basin, he saw that a fresh bar of soap and a clean, mended towel were laid out, separate from the one he and Lily used. It was a small thing, a boundary she had set, a quiet statement that she was here to serve, not to intrude. But in its own way, it was an act of profound intimacy. She had seen a need and met it without being asked. She understood his world, his routines. Later that night, as he sat cleaning a piece of tack, Clara was teaching Lily how to properly clean a slate. Her hands guided the child's, her touch gentle and sure. He saw Lily's shoulders, usually tensed and high, relax under Clara's patient instruction. Guardedness was shifting to trust, not only for his daughter, but for him. He was beginning to see Clara not as a housekeeper, but as a quiet, steady light in his dim world. The sight of her head bent near his daughter's, under the warm glow of the lamp, sent a sharp, unfamiliar pang of yearning through him, a desire for a closeness he had long ago given up on. The first word was a miracle, whispered so softly it was almost stolen by the breeze. Clara and Lily were in the small garden patch behind the cabin, their fingers deep in the dark, rich earth. Clara had been naming the plants, her voice a low drone. more for her own comfort than for any expectation of a response. "And this one," she'd said, touching the velvety leaf of a lamb's ear, "feels like a little comfort." Lily, who had been watching, reached out and stroked the leaf with one small finger. She looked up at Clara, her eyes wide and serious. "Comfort," she whispered, the word a tiny, perfect puff of air. Clara's heart stopped. She did not gasp or exclaim. She simply met the child's gaze and smiled, a slow, radiant smile of pure, unadulterated joy. She knew the fragility of this moment, that to startle the child would be to send her back into her shell. So she just nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Yes," she replied, her own voice soft. "Comfort." From the doorway of the smithy, Elias had seen it all. He had not heard the word, but he had seen the look on Clara's face, the way she froze, the way a light seemed to emanate from her. He had seen Lily's lips move. His hammer fell from his hand, clattering unnoticed on the dirt floor. He felt a crack run through the iron wall he had built around his heart. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. It was charged with a shared, unspoken secret. Lily was still silent around him, but there was a new brightness in her eyes. After he tucked her into bed, Elias found Clara on the small porch, looking out at the star-dusted sky. He stood beside her, the wooden rail cool beneath his hands. The silence stretched, but it was a warm, expectant silence now. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. She turned to look at him, her face pale in the moonlight. She is a remarkable child. She just needed someone to be quiet with. He understood. Clara had not filled the silence with noise. She had filled it with patience. She had earned what he, with all his desperate love, could not. The longing he had been feeling for weeks now had a name. It was a deep, aching desire for this woman's gentleness, for her quiet strength, to be a permanent part of his life, of Lily's life. "Your room," he said, his voice rough. "The roof leaks over the bed when it rains hard. I mean to fix it." It was a clumsy offering, a way to show his gratitude through the work of his hands. "Thank you, Elias," she said softly. The sound of his name on her lips was a tender intimacy. The next day he worked on the roof, his hammer strikes sure and steady. He was not just mending a roof. He was mending his home. He was making a safe, warm place for the woman who had brought a word, a single precious word, back into his silent world. The summer heat finally broke with a thunderstorm that rolled in from the plains, a dramatic onslaught of wind and rain that rattled the cabin's windows. The roof over the main room, the one Elias had built and maintained with pride, held strong. But the patch over Clara's small room, the one he had just mended, held for all of an hour before a persistent drip. Drip, drip began, a dark stain spreading on the ceiling planks. He heard it from the main room, where he was reading by the fire, and a curse muttered under his breath. He had failed in his one tangible promise to her. When he pushed open her door, she was standing on a stool, trying to wedge a tin pot against the ceiling to catch the water. She was already soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead, and her bedding was a damp, miserable heap on the floor. In the midst of the storm's fury, a different kind of storm broke inside the cabin. A piercing cry from Lily's room, a sound of pure terror, as a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. Clara was off the stool in an instant, forgetting her own discomfort and rushing to the child's side. Elias followed, his heart pounding. They found Lily sitting bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with fear, tears streaming down her face. Clara didn't hesitate. She sat on the edge of the bed and gathered the trembling child into her arms, murmuring soft, soothing words, her own dampness forgotten. Elias stood in the doorway, a helpless giant, watching this woman comfort his daughter in a way he never could. The room was cold, the sound of the storm terrifying. He knew he could not leave them there. "Bring her out by the fire," he said, his voice a low command born of pure protective instinct. "It's the warmest place." Clara looked up at him, her eyes questioning, but she nodded, lifting Lily into her arms. He had already laid a thick bearskin rug and a pile of dry blankets on the floor before the hearth. The space was an island of warmth and light in the tumultuous night. Clara settled Lily onto the blankets, wrapping her securely, and then went to sit on a nearby stool, intending to keep a respectful distance. She shivered in her wet clothes, her arms wrapped around herself. "You cannot stay in those," Elias said, his tone firm but gentle. "You'll catch your death." He turned his back to her, a deliberate act of granting her privacy. "My late wife's things are in that chest. Find something dry. I will. I will not look." He felt the vulnerability in the air, the charged intimacy of the moment. He was asking her to trust him completely. He heard the creak of the chest opening, the rustle of fabric. When he finally turned back, she was dressed in a simple, worn flannel nightgown, her wet clothes neatly folded on the stool. She stood uncertainly, her gaze flickering from the sleeping child to him. "Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest, breaking his own rule of formality. "Lie down with the child. Keep her warm." He paused, and then added the words that changed everything, the words that offered a choice, not a command. "It is the only thing that matters tonight. Please, only if you want." Her breath hitched. "Only if you want." The offering was one of pure care, for her and for his daughter. In that moment, he wasn't her employer. He was a man asking for her help, offering a shared sanctuary. She gave a small, grateful nod, the tension leaving her shoulders. She lay down on the rug beside Lily, pulling a blanket over them both. Elias took his own blanket and settled into his chair, promising to keep watch. They were not touching, a careful foot of space between his chair and her spot on the floor, but in the warm, fire-lit dark, with the storm raging outside, they were closer than they had ever been. Palm up on the wood between them. It was an offering of silent support, a place for her to rest her own story. "Clara," he said, the name a firm anchor in the turbulent sea of her past. "You are not that person anymore. You are not beholden to anyone." He paused, his gaze locking with hers, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a vow spoken in the sacred quiet of the firelit cabin. "You are safe here." She looked at his hand, large and calloused, a smith's hand capable of shaping unyielding metal, and yet offered with such profound gentleness. After a long moment, she placed her own hand in his. It was not a romantic gesture, but an act of alliance, a sealing of a pact. He was no longer just a man who had offered her shelter. He was the guardian of her newfound freedom. And in that moment, she was no longer just a woman hiding from her past. She was a woman preparing to stand her ground. The confession hung in the air between them for days, not as a heavy secret, but as a new layer of truth that bound them closer. Elias found himself watching her with a new, fierce tenderness. He was not just protecting a woman in need. He was protecting Clara, the woman who had taught his daughter the word for comfort, the woman who had trusted him with the story of her survival. He understood that to truly be her partner, he had to offer a piece of his own brokenness in return. He had never spoken of his late wife, Martha, to anyone. The grief was a private, walled-off garden inside him, but Clara had shown him her scars. He could not, in honor, continue to hide all of his. He found her one evening by the creek, washing the ink from Lily's fingers after a drawing lesson. The setting sun cast a golden light on the water. "Lily has her mother's eyes," he said, his voice quiet. Clara looked up, startled. He never mentioned his wife. She simply waited, giving him the same patient silence he had once given her. Martha was... She was like a song, he continued, struggling for the words. The house was always full of her humming, her laughter. When she died birthing Lily, the music just stopped. And I didn't know how to start it again. He looked at his daughter, who was now chasing a dragonfly, her silence a stark contrast to the memory of her mother's song. "I think I resented the quiet," he admitted, the confession costing him a great deal. "And I was afraid. Afraid that if I let anyone else in, it would mean I was forgetting her." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes full of a raw, painful honesty. "But you're quiet." "It isn't an empty quiet. It's peaceful. You didn't try to replace the song. You just brought a harmony to the silence." He took a steadying breath. "I want to ask you to stay, Clara, not as a governess, not out of necessity." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately twisted piece of iron he had forged. It was a simple brooch, shaped like a willow leaf. "I want you to stay because this is your home now, if you'll have it. Because we are stronger with you here." He held out the brooch. It was not a diamond ring, not a grand proposal, but it was a piece of him, forged in fire and sincerity. It was a promise of permanence, an invitation to build a new life on the foundations of their shared sorrows. Clara looked from the iron leaf, a symbol of resilience and strength, to the vulnerable hope in his eyes. She knew what it cost him to speak of his wife, to open that locked room in his heart. He was offering her not just a future, but his past as well, trusting her with all of it. She took the brooch, her fingers closing around the cool, solid metal. "Elias," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have been looking for a place to disappear, but I think what I really wanted was a place to be found." She pinned the brooch to her collar, the dark metal a stark, beautiful contrast against the simple fabric of her dress. It was her answer. It was her yes. Mr. Sterling did not ride up like a villain in a dime novel, flanked by hired thugs. He arrived in a polished buggy, a man so convinced of his own authority that he required no show of force. He found Elias and Clara near the woodshed, stacking firewood, with Lily drawing in the dirt nearby. His smile was a thin, predatory slash in his well-groomed face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice oozing a possessive familiarity, "your little game of hide-and-seek is over. I've come to take you home." Clara froze, the color draining from her face. But the terror that had once paralyzed her was now tempered by the solid, steady presence of the man standing beside her. Elias did not move, did not speak. He set down the log he was holding with a quiet thud and simply watched Sterling, his stillness a more potent threat than any weapon. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "And I am already home." Sterling's gaze flickered dismissively to Elias, then back to her. "Don't be foolish. You are a governess, a hired servant. This rustic arrangement is beneath you. I have settled your father's debts. You are free to return with me, as we discussed." "The arrangement we discussed was a lie," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "And I am not your servant. Then what are you?" Sterling sneered, his voice rising, drawing the attention of Lily, who had scrambled to her feet. "The charity case of this backwoods blacksmith? A fallen woman?" He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to claim her. In that moment, Elias moved. He did not step in front of Clara. He stepped to her side. He did not draw a weapon. He simply reached down and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a quiet, irrefutable statement of partnership, of belonging. His thumb stroked the back of her hand in a gesture of silent reassurance. "This woman is my intended wife," Elias said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that carried across the yard. "You will not address her with such disrespect. You will leave my property now." Sterling stopped, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come expecting a frightened, compliant woman he could easily intimidate. He had not expected this silent, immovable man, and a woman who now stood beside him, her chin held high, her hand locked in his. The true climax of the confrontation came not from the men, but from the child. Lily, who had been watching with wide, frightened eyes, walked forward and stood directly in front of Clara, facing the intruder. She put her small hands on her hips, a perfect imitation of a protective stance she must have seen Clara take 100 times. She looked Sterling directly in the eye, and with a voice that was clear and strong and full of a child's righteous fury, she said, "Go." It was a single word, but it was a cannon blast in the quiet yard. It was the voice of a child claiming her family, defending her home. Sterling stared at the little girl, at the unshakable couple behind her, and he knew he was defeated. Their silent, united strength was a fortress he could not breach. With a final venomous glare, he turned, climbed back into his buggy, and rode away, leaving behind not a victory, but the profound, resonant silence of a family that had chosen each other. The buggy disappeared over the rise, taking with it the last shadow of Clara's past. The tension that had held them all rigid in the yard did not vanish instantly. It seeped away slowly, like water into dry ground, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it was almost euphoric. Clara's knees felt weak, and her hand, still clasped in Elias's, was trembling. He turned to her, his grip tightening, his eyes searching her face with a look of fierce, tender concern. He led her to the porch steps and sat her down, kneeling before her. He did not speak. He simply took both of her trembling hands in his large, warm palms engulfing hers, willing his own strength into her. Lily, her own small act of courage having drained her, climbed onto the step beside Clara and curled into her side, wrapping her arms around her waist. She laid her head on Clara's lap, a gesture of complete, unconditional love and trust. And then, so softly that only Clara could hear it, she whispered, "God finally gave me a mother." Clara's breath caught in a sob, and the tears she had held back finally fell. Not tears of fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. She was not the hired help. She was not a charity case. She was a mother. She was a partner. She was home. That evening, the cabin was filled with a gentle, healing light. Elias cooked, a rare reversal of their roles. He moved with a clumsy but endearing purpose, feeding them a simple stew, as if the act itself were a form of prayer. He tended to her, seeing the emotional weariness in her eyes, ensuring her cup was full, that she ate. It was the purest form of aftercare, a quiet tending of her spirit after the battle had been won. He washed the ink from a small smudge on her finger that she hadn't noticed, his touch impossibly gentle. Later, after Lily was asleep, her dreams peaceful for the first time in a long time, Elias sat across from Clara at the small kitchen table. The silence was a soft blanket. He had given her his protection. She had given him a family. They had saved each other. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The simple, plain vow came from the deepest part of his heart. "I will spend the rest of my days making sure you always feel this safe." It was a promise that settled into the very foundations of the house, a foundation no longer built on sorrow, but on a resilient, hard-won love. In the weeks that followed, the promises made in the heat of confrontation and the tenderness of its aftermath were woven into the fabric of their daily lives. The future was no longer a distant, uncertain shore, but the very ground beneath their feet. Elias rode to the county seat, and when he returned, he carried not only supplies, but a new deed, the names Elias Thorne and Clara Thorne, written in the clerk's careful, looping script. He did not make a grand presentation of it. He simply left it on the table for her to find, a quiet legal testament to the truth that already existed in their hearts. She found it while he was at the forge, the weight of the official paper in her hands, a tangible anchor. Her past was gone, her future named. That evening, she took the ledger where he kept his accounts and his rough-drawn plans for projects. It was a chaotic mess of numbers and sketches. With her neat, careful hand, she began to organize it, bringing a quiet order to his business, just as she had brought order to his home and his heart. It was her own practical vow, a sign that his life was now her life, their endeavor shared. One evening, as Lily slept, Elias came to Clara as she sat by the dying fire. He held out his hand, not for comfort, not for alliance, but as a simple, direct question. "May I?" he asked, his voice low. He didn't need to say more. He was asking to hold her, to finally bridge the last physical distance between them. Her answer was not a word, but an action. She placed her hand in his, and he gently drew her to her feet. His other hand went to her waist, carefully, deliberately, his touch asking for permission at every stage. She leaned into him, her head finding its natural place on his chest, her arms circling his strong back. He held her, simply held her, in the warm, quiet dark of their home. It was an embrace that contained all the yearning, all the trust, all the shared battles and quiet victories of the past months. It was not about passion, but about belonging. He smelled of wood smoke and iron and safety. "Clara," he whispered into her hair, and this time, when he spoke, it was not a vow of protection, but a confession of a love that had grown so deep and strong it had become a part of him. "I love you." She tilted her head back to look at him, the firelight catching the tears of joy in her eyes. "And I love you, Elias." Their wedding was as quiet and as true as the life they had built. The circuit preacher, a tired man with kind eyes, stood with them on the porch of their cabin, the late summer sun warm on their faces. Lily stood between them, holding both of their hands, her presence the most sacred vow of all. There were no crowds, no fancy clothes, just the three of them and the wide open sky as their witness. Elias's words were simple, forged in the heart of a man who had learned that strength was not in solitude, but in partnership. Clara's voice, when she spoke her vows, was clear and steady, the voice of a woman who had found her power not in running, but in choosing to stand still, to love and to be loved. After the preacher had gone, they shared a meal, not as an employer and a housekeeper, but as a family. Lily, who now chattered away, her voice a constant happy music in the cabin, told them a long rambling story about a family of squirrels she had seen that morning. Elias and Clara exchanged a look over her head, a smile of such profound, shared happiness that it needed no words. That night, for the first time, Elias led his wife into the bedroom, to the bed he had shared with his first wife and had kept empty for 2 long years. He had replaced the old mattress with a new one, stuffed with fresh, sweet-smelling hay and lavender Clara had gathered. It was a bed with no ghosts, only a future. He did not take her in a rush of pent-up passion. Instead, he undressed her slowly, reverently, his calloused hands gentle on her skin, his touch a form of worship. He asked, at every step, with his eyes, with his hands, if this was what she wanted, and her serene, trusting gaze gave him her unwavering yes. They came together not as 2 lonely people seeking solace, but as 2 whole souls choosing to become one, their union a quiet, sacred culmination of a love built on patience, respect, and the mending of a life once lived alone. The first autumn of their marriage painted the hills in shades of gold and amber. The cabin, once a bastion against the world, was now a warm, open heart. The routines they had established as strangers had softened into the comfortable, easy rhythms of a family. In the mornings, the scent of coffee mingled with the sound of Lily's laughter. In the evenings, the glow from their window was a beacon of warmth and belonging. Elias's forge was busier than ever, his work infused with a new joy, a new purpose. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a husband and a father, building a life, not just a living. He forged a new latch for their front door, not to keep the world out, but to secure the sanctuary within. It was shaped like 2 intertwined willow leaves. Clara's garden thrived under her care. The pantry was full, the shelves lined with jars of preserves, a colorful testament to her hope and foresight. She had found her strength not in being invisible, but in nurturing the world around her, in making things grow. One crisp evening, they stood on the porch, wrapped together in a single quilt, watching the first stars prick the deep purple sky. Lily was asleep inside, safe and warm. Elias pressed a small, cold object into Clara's hand. It was an iron key, one he had forged himself. It was heavy, solid, and true. "It was always your home, Clara," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "But now you have the key." She curled her fingers around it, the metal warming to her touch. It was the final token, the last quiet promise. She had come to his door, seeking shelter, and had found a sanctuary. She had hoped to lose her past, and had found her future. She tilted her face up to his, her love for him shining in her eyes. This man, this child, this home, they were her foundation, her anchor, her safe harbor. And in the quiet peace of their shared life, she knew she was finally, truly, irrevocably found.